The death of a child should bring a family together, but for Kody Brown, Garrison's funeral became the final nail in the coffin of his relationship with his surviving children. What happened at those memorial services was so shocking, so completely tone-deaf, that it severed the last fragile threads connecting this father to the kids who once looked up to him. Sources close to the Brown family reveal that Kody's behavior during Garrison's memorial events left his children absolutely stunned. We're talking about a man who had already lost the respect of most of his 18 kids, but somehow managed to make things even worse during the most sacred and painful moment of their lives. The details that are emerging paint a picture of a father so consumed with his own grief performance that he forgot he wasn't the only one mourning. Insiders whisper that Kody treated the memorial like it was his personal spotlight moment. While his children were trying to process the devastating loss of their brother, their father was allegedly more focused on how he appeared to others than supporting his grieving family. Palace sources suggest he made comments and decisions that left his kids feeling like their pain didn't matter compared to his own dramatic display of grief. The most heartbreaking part, this wasn't just any funeral, this was Garrison's memorial. A young man who had already been estranged from his father, who had died without that relationship being repaired. You'd think that reality would humble any parent, would make them realize how precious and fragile these family connections really are. But apparently not Kody Brown. What's emerging from family insiders is that Kody's behavior was so egregious that children who had been hanging on by a thread, who might have given him one more chance, walked away completely. We're talking about kids who had already watched their father systematically destroy relationships with their mothers, who had seen him play favorites and manipulate situations for years, but somehow they still had a tiny bit of hope left. Until those memorial services, the specific incidents that unfolded have been kept largely private out of respect for Garrison's memory, but the fallout speaks volumes. When your own children publicly declare they haven't seen you since their brother's funeral, when they're begging strangers on social media not to compare them to you, that tells you everything you need to know about how badly you messed up. And here's the most devastating part of all this tragedy. This wasn't some random family drama or typical Brown family chaos. This was a father failing his children during the worst moment of their lives, when they needed him most. When grief should have brought them together, Kody Brown found a way to make it all about himself. But that was just the beginning of how spectacularly this man would continue to fail his surviving children. The proof of just how badly Kody destroyed things at Garrison's memorial came in the most public and heartbreaking way possible. His own children started making statements that no parent should ever have to hear. Paedon and Kody Brown didn't just quietly distance themselves from their father. They went public with declarations that should make any parent's blood run cold. Both kids have stated publicly and unequivocally that they haven't seen their father since Garrison's funeral. Think about that for a moment. The last time these children saw their dad was at their brother's burial. The last memory they have of being in the same space as the man who raised them was during the most traumatic day of their lives. And apparently whatever happened during those services was so awful that they decided right then and there that they were done. This isn't some temporary cooling off period we're talking about here. This isn't kids being dramatic or going through a rebellious phase. These are young adults who made a conscious decision to completely cut contact with their father immediately following their brother's death. The timing tells you everything you need to know about how spectacularly Kody failed during what should have been a moment of family unity. Kody's situation is particularly heartbreaking because she had been one of the few children still maintaining some kind of relationship with her father. She wasn't completely estranged like some of her siblings. She was still talking to him, still giving him chances, still hoping that maybe he could change and be the father she needed him to be. But whatever happened at those memorial services was apparently her breaking point. And then there's the devastating reality that these kids are now processing their grief without any support from their surviving parent. They're dealing with the loss of their brother while simultaneously grieving the complete breakdown of their relationship with their father. It's trauma on top of trauma, and it's all because Kody couldn't manage to behave appropriately during the most important moment when his family needed him. Sources close to the family suggest that other siblings are also maintaining their distance, but Paedon and Kody are the ones who have been most vocal about their decision. The fact that they're willing to make these statements publicly shows just how far beyond repair these relationships have become. When you're willing to tell the world that you haven't seen your father since your brother's funeral, that's not a cry for attention. That's a statement of finality. The most tragic part, this was completely preventable. All Kody had to do was show up for his children during the worst moment of their lives. Instead, he managed to make their grief even worse. But the public rejection was just getting started. If you want to understand just how completely Kody Brown has failed as a father, look no further than his son Paedon's desperate plea on TikTok. This young man was so horrified by the idea of being compared to his father that he literally begged his followers to stop making the connection. When your own child is publicly asking strangers not to associate them with you, that's not just family drama. That's complete parental failure. Paedon didn't just casually mention that he didn't want to be like his dad. He actively pleaded with people to stop comparing him to that guy. Not even my father or my dad, just that guy. The emotional distance in those two words says everything about how this young man now views the person who raised him. Kody has become so toxic in his son's eyes that Paedon can't even bring himself to acknowledge the family connection. Think about what it takes for someone to get to that point. This isn't a teenager having a tantrum or a young adult going through a rebellious phase. This is a grown man who has watched his father's behavior for years and decided he wants absolutely nothing to do with that legacy. He's so concerned about people seeing similarities between them that he's willing to publicly distance himself in the most definitive way possible. The timing of this TikTok plea is particularly devastating. This came after Garrison's funeral, after whatever happened at those memorial services that finally broke Paedon's last thread of connection to his father. He went from someone who was still engaging with Kody, still part of the family dynamic, to someone actively rejecting any association with the Brown patriarch. What makes this even more heartbreaking is that Paedon is essentially orphaning himself emotionally. He's choosing to be fatherless rather than maintain any connection to Kody. When a child makes that choice, when they decide that having no father is better than having the father they've got, that tells you everything about how toxic that relationship had become. And it's not like Paedon is trying to be cruel or dramatic. Sources suggest he's simply protecting his own mental health and future relationships. He's watched what happens to people who stay in Kody's orbit too long. He's seen the manipulation, the favoritism, the emotional games, and he's decided he wants no part of it, even if it means publicly rejecting his own father. The most devastating part, Kody doesn't seem to understand the gravity of what his son did. While Paedon is desperately trying to separate himself from his father's reputation, Kody continues operating like nothing has changed. He's still playing the victim, still acting like he's the one who's been wronged by his ungrateful children. But Paedon's public rejection was nothing compared to what was about to be revealed on national television. Then came the moment that should have been Kody's redemption arc, but instead became the most pathetic display of fake accountability we've ever seen on reality television. Episode 7 of Special Forces featured Kody's interrogation with the directing staff, where he broke down crying about being a failed husband and father. For a brief moment, viewers almost felt sorry for this man, as he seemed to take responsibility for destroying his family. Almost. The directing staff didn't hold back as they grilled him about his relationships with his children and ex-wives. They called him out for being controlling, for demanding that everyone sing to his tune, for only caring about his family as long as they agreed with everything he believed. And for once in his life, Kody seemed to admit they were right. He acknowledged that he should have had stronger relationships with his children. He claimed he was ready to say he'd been wrong. "My failures were because I didn't know about being good dad and husband," he sobbed to the military personnel. "I really thought I did. I misunderstood that, and I did it wrong in so many ways." The tears flowed as he admitted to being resistant to taking ownership, because he hated being blamed for anything. It was supposedly his moment of breakthrough, his acknowledgement that all the faults were his and his alone. But here's the thing about Kody Brown that makes this whole performance so disgusting. This man is a master manipulator who knows exactly what to say when the cameras are rolling. He's been playing the victim and the reformed sinner for over a decade on Sister Wives. He knows how to cry on command, how to say the words people want to hear, how to make himself look like he's growing and changing. The most telling part of his Special Forces breakdown, none of his children even knew he was going on the show. He didn't bother to tell Paedon, Kelty, or any of his other kids that he was about to go on national television to discuss their relationship. That right there tells you everything about how sincere his remorse really was. If he was genuinely trying to rebuild bridges with his children, wouldn't he at least give them a heads up? And the timing makes it even more suspicious. This was filmed in June, months after Garrison's funeral, months after he'd already lost contact with most of his surviving children. So either he was completely clueless about how badly he'd destroyed things, or he was using his son's death and his family's pain as content for a reality show. Either option is absolutely disgusting. But the real test of whether Kody had actually changed would come in how his children reacted to seeing their father's supposed breakthrough. Kelty's reaction to watching her father's breakdown on Special Forces was absolutely heartbreaking and revealed just how deep the damage really goes. During her Patreon watch-along, she had an emotional response that showed the complicated feelings so many of Kody's children are dealing with. She admitted to having tears while watching the episode and said she'd rewatched it multiple times, still struggling with conflicting emotions about what she saw. "I both like and don't like what my dad said in this scene," Mykelti revealed to her followers. "He has a lot of accountability and it's refreshing. It is refreshing to see Special Forces has done something good for him. But here's what makes this so tragic. This was apparently the first time Mykelti had ever heard her father take real responsibility for his failures. Think about that. She's his daughter, and she had to watch him on a reality TV show to finally hear him admit he'd been wrong. The most devastating part of Mykelti's reaction was how surprised she seemed by her father's words. This was all brand new information to her. She'd never heard him acknowledge that he'd failed as a father. She'd never heard him admit that his relationships with his children were broken because of his own actions. Her own father had to go on national television and be interrogated by military personnel before he could say the words his daughter needed to hear. But Mykelti isn't naive about her father's pattern of behavior. Even while acknowledging that his words felt refreshing, she was clearly skeptical about whether this represented real change or just another one of his famous performances. And her followers picked up on that skepticism immediately, asking the hard questions that were on everyone's minds. The most important question came from her patrons. Has Kody changed, though? Did you see a change in him when he came back from this? This wasn't just curiosity about reality TV drama. This was Mykelti's community trying to help her process whether her father's televised breakdown meant anything for their real relationship. Mykelti's husband Tony provided some insight, revealing that Kody did reach out to Mykelti soon after filming Special Forces. Apparently, she was probably one of the first children he contacted, which makes sense since they'd maintained more contact than his other kids. But even that outreach was telling. Tony mentioned that Kody has reached out multiple times, but that Mykelti wasn't always in a place to have actual phone conversations with him. The fact that their relationship status is described as pending says everything. Even his most accessible child, the one who's been most willing to give him chances, still can't fully commit to rebuilding their relationship. But the real question everyone wanted answered was whether this apparent change was reaching his other children. Here's where Kody's supposed transformation after Special Forces reveals itself to be nothing more than selective damage control. While he was quick to reach out to Mykelti, the daughter who had maintained the most contact with him, he apparently couldn't be bothered to extend that same effort to all of his children. And the ones he ignored? They're still publicly stating they haven't heard from him since Garrison's funeral. Tony revealed during Mykelti's watch-along that Kody reached out to her really soon after filming Special Forces, and that he'd contacted her multiple times since then. But when followers asked about his outreach to Mykelti's siblings, Tony was very careful to say they wouldn't speak on what Kody's relationship was like with any of her brothers and sisters. Translation: business as usual for everyone else. The pattern here is absolutely maddening and shows that Kody learned absolutely nothing from his televised breakdown. He's still playing favorites, still taking the easy route, still avoiding the hard conversations with the children who need the most repair work. Mykelti was already one of the few kids still talking to him occasionally, so reaching out to her required minimal effort and came with the lowest risk of rejection. But what about Paedon, who was so desperate to distance himself from his father that he begged TikTok followers to stop comparing them? Radio silence. What about the other children who cut contact after the memorial services? Apparently, they didn't warrant the same post-Special Forces outreach that Mykelti received. It's the same favoritism and emotional laziness that got Kody into this mess in the first place. Sources suggest that if Kody had genuinely changed, if his Special Forces experience had really transformed him, he would have reached out to every single one of his children. He would have started with the ones who needed the most healing, not the one who was already most likely to respond positively. But that's not what happened, because Kody's version of change is always about making himself feel better, not actually doing the hard work of repairing relationships. The fact that Paedon is still saying he hasn't talked to his father tells us everything we need to know about how comprehensive Kody's post-Special Forces transformation really was. Mykelti even mentioned recently that she told her dad he would need to fix his relationship specifically with Truly and Isabel before she could be fully receptive to rebuilding their relationship. But apparently, Kody's idea of change doesn't extend to doing the hard work with the children who require more effort. But his selective outreach wasn't the only area where Kody's supposed transformation fell short. Perhaps the most revealing example of Kody's complete emotional disconnect came in what he didn't do during one of his family's most joyful moments. While he was off filming Special Forces, successes and having his televised breakdown about being a failed father, his daughter Madison was giving birth to her fourth child. And apparently congratulating his daughter on her new baby wasn't important enough to make it onto Kody's priority list. Madison had her newborn just a couple of months before Kody went to film Special Forces. Sources suggest that Kody definitely heard about the birth through the family grapevine, and he certainly could have found out by simply logging onto the internet, but insiders whisper that he never reached out to Madison to congratulate her on the arrival of her new baby. Let that sink in for a moment. His daughter had a child, and he couldn't be bothered to send even a simple congratulations message. This is particularly devastating when you consider the timing and Madison's relationship status with her father. On Sister Wives, Janelle revealed that it had been 2 or 3 years since Madison had even spoken to Kody, so here was a perfect opportunity for him to extend an olive branch to show that he cared about his daughter's happiness, to demonstrate that becoming a grandfather again meant something to him. Instead, nothing. But here's what makes this even more infuriating. On the show, Kody has specifically singled out Madison as being the ringleader of the family gossip mill. He's blamed her for stirring up drama and influencing other family members against him. So when she had a major life event, when she experienced one of the most beautiful moments a person can have, his response was to continue giving her the cold shoulder. The contrast is absolutely staggering. This is the same man who went on Special Forces crying about how he'd failed as a father, admitting that he should have had stronger relationships with his children, claiming he was ready to do better. But when presented with a real opportunity to show growth, to reach out to a daughter he'd been estranged from, he did absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, Madison named her new baby Amelia Estelle, with the middle name chosen to honor Garrison. She's processing the joy of new life while grieving the loss of her brother, and her own father can't even acknowledge either of these massive emotional experiences she's going through. This wasn't an oversight or a busy schedule conflict. This was a conscious choice that reveals everything about Kody's priorities and his version of being a changed man. One of the most frustrating things Mykelti revealed during her emotional watch-along was how Kody continues to lump all of his children together as one unit. Even when discussing his failures as a father, she suspects he does this to protect individual kids from getting singled out, but it actually reveals something much more sinister about how he views his relationships with his children. He doesn't see them as individual people with unique needs and different levels of relationship repair required. This lumping strategy is classic Kody Brown manipulation disguised as protection. By talking about his kids as a collective group, he avoids taking responsibility for the specific ways he's failed each individual child. He doesn't have to acknowledge that his relationship with Paedon requires different repair work than his relationship with Mykelti. He doesn't have to face the reality that some of his children need more effort and accountability than others. Mykelti wishes her father wouldn't use this strategy because it shows he's still not willing to do the individual work that real relationships require. Each of his children has been hurt in different ways. Some have been ignored, others have been manipulated, some have been used as weapons against their mothers, but Kody's lazy approach treats all of these different relationship failures as if they're the same problem with the same solution. The favoritism that's always defined Kody's parenting style is still alive and well, just packaged differently now. He reached out to Mykelti after Special Forces, but apparently not to Paedon or Madison or the other children who cut contact after Garrison's memorial. He's still taking the easy route with the kids who require less effort while ignoring the ones who need the most healing. But perhaps the most telling example of his continued favoritism is how he's handling the children who are still publicly supporting him. Logan has been commenting on Instagram posts about Special Forces, hyping his dad up and showing public support. And you can bet that Kody is eating up that validation while completely ignoring the children who are struggling with his behavior. This selective attention is exactly the same pattern that destroyed his marriages and alienated most of his children in the first place. He gravitates toward the relationships that make him feel good about himself while avoiding the ones that require him to face uncomfortable truths about his behavior. It's emotional laziness disguised as protection, and it shows that his Special Forces breakdown was just another performance. The fact that he's still operating this way, even after publicly admitting he'd failed as a father, shows just how deep his dysfunction really runs. In the midst of all this family devastation, there's one Brown child who's been publicly supporting his father, and it's creating an even more complex dynamic within this fractured family. Logan Brown has been commenting on Instagram posts about Special Forces, hyping up his dad and showing public support during what should be Kody's lowest moment. And you can bet that Kody is clinging to that validation like a life raft, while completely completely ignoring the children who are drowning in their pain. Logan's support is particularly significant because he's one of the older children who has generally stayed out of the public family drama. He's been more private about his relationship with his father compared to some of his siblings who have been very vocal about their estrangement. So when he does speak up publicly to support Kody, it carries weight and gives his father something to point to as proof that not all of his children have abandoned him. But here's what makes this support so problematic in the context of everything else that's happening. While Logan is publicly defending his father on social media, Paedon is begging people not to compare him to that guy, and Mykelti is processing complicated feelings about whether her dad has actually changed. The contrast is stark and shows just how differently Kody's various children are coping with the family breakdown. Sources close to the family suggest that Logan's public support is exactly the kind of validation that allows Kody to avoid facing the full scope of his failures. Instead of focusing on the children who desperately need repair work in their relationships, Kody can point to Logan's comments and convince himself that he's not as bad a father as everyone says. It's the perfect excuse to avoid doing the hard work with the kids who require more effort. The timing of Logan's support is also telling. While other children were cutting contact after Garrison's memorial, Logan was maintaining enough of a relationship with his father to feel comfortable publicly defending him. This suggests that Logan either wasn't present for whatever happened at those memorial services, or he has a very different perspective on his father's behavior than his siblings do. But the most concerning aspect of this dynamic is how it's creating division among the Brown children themselves. When one sibling is publicly supporting the parent that other siblings are trying to distance themselves from, it creates additional stress and potential conflict within an already traumatized family system. And all of this brings us to the most disturbing aspect of this entire situation. And here we arrive at the most chilling aspect of this entire tragic story. Kody Brown is a man who lost one son to death and seems completely unbothered by the fact that he's actively losing the rest of his children to his own behavior. Think about that for a moment. Any normal parent who had just buried a child would be desperately clinging to their surviving children, would be doing everything in their power to strengthen those precious relationships, but not Kody. Instead of Garrison's death serving as a wake-up call about how fragile and important family relationships are, Kody somehow managed to use his son's memorial services to drive away even more of his children. The man who should have been humbled by grief, who should have been motivated to repair every possible relationship while there was still time, instead behaved so badly that his surviving children decided they were done with him forever. What kind of person does that? What kind of father watches his children cut contact one by one and doesn't seem concerned enough to do the real work required to fix things? We're talking about a man whose own son publicly begged strangers not to compare him to his father, and Kody's response has been to continue operating like nothing has changed. The most disturbing part is how unbothered he seems by all of this. While his children are processing their grief without any support from their surviving parent, while they're making public statements about not wanting to be associated with him, Kody continues playing the victim and focusing on the few scraps of validation he can still get. He's more concerned with how he looks on reality TV than with the fact that he's systematically destroyed his relationships with the people who should matter most. Sources suggest that a normal parent in this situation would be in panic mode, would be doing everything possible to rebuild these relationships before it's too late. But Kody's version of change involves crying on camera for military personnel while continuing the same patterns of favoritism and emotional laziness that got him into this mess in the first place. The tragedy is that Garrison's death should have been the moment that brought this family together, the event that reminded everyone how precious and fragile these relationships really are. Instead, it became the final breaking point that severed whatever connections were still hanging by a thread. And the most heartbreaking part, Kody doesn't seem to understand that when you lose a child, the appropriate response is to hold your surviving children closer, not to drive them further away through your own selfish behavior. What's your take on Kody's behavior after Garrison's death? Can a father ever come back from driving his children away during their darkest moment? Drop your thoughts below, hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed because the Brown family drama is far from over and you won't want to miss what's coming next.